Hot Take Express.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Hot Take Express. I am your host, Kent Chamberlain, missing the monsoon showers of June already as unseasonably hot weather rolls in. You'll have to forgive the sound of fans in the background, but they make life bearable right now. But I didn't get on here to complain about the weather. You see, the radical Republicans have been so busy that I have to dedicate an entire episode just to our activities. We had a meeting on Friday the 21st. That was the solstice. Anyhow, we voted through two items. The first was an amendment to the Radical Republicans' Constitution reading as follows. Whereas the practice of polyamory prevalent on the modern left has committed scientifically documented harm against the proper development of children, and whereas this practice also destroys the family, the cornerstone of America and all other countries, the modern practice of polyamory is inconsistent with membership or voting rights in the Radical Republicans. This amendment does not forbid the adherents or practitioners of any genuine religious tradition that practices polygamy or polyandry from membership or voting rights in this organization. What does this mean? It means you can't be polyamorous and join the Radical Republicans now. Or, if you're in an organization whose membership criteria we can't control, but that organization is formally affiliated with the Radical Republicans and therefore gets two voting representatives to our secretariat, you can't be polyamorous and be one of those representatives. Your org would have to choose someone else to represent their interests in the secretariat. This is why we went with the wording membership or voting rights, and we did it with an anti-land back clause in our Constitution as well, Clause 3B. Now, this will be our Constitution's first amendment, coming directly after the Culture Truce Clause 3H. There's a little discordance there. Opinions on polyamory seem like they'd fall into the category of culture war. But we laid out the reasoning behind this amendment in the amendment itself. Children who grow up in polyamorous relationships, according to James Waller in the book Becoming Evil, have more distant relationships with their parents and weaker familial bonds in general, and that's why he considers a cultural predilection for polyamory to be a potential precondition for genocide. The Mongols practiced polygamy, and the Third Reich was immediately preceded by the free love and loose sexual mores of Weimar Germany. This observation tracks. And Waller wasn't even talking about the modern practice of polyamory prevalent on today's left, which only really came into full being after his book was published. There's horror stories of children in polyamorous relationships getting abused by their parents' new partners, and of children discovering what their parents are doing and getting dispirited that they might ever find a normal relationship with someone who wants to be with only them, and horrified that their parents would do that to a spouse they claim to love, and of children being essentially ghosted by their own parents. One such example I read about was a boy's parents planning some sex trip around the weekend of his 18th birthday. The boy finally got tired of being continually neglected and told his grandfather, who was totally in the dark about the polyamory situation, what was going on. The grandfather then told him they'd celebrate together. Before the parents left, the grandfather showed up at their house, reminded them that they were going to have sex with strangers on their son's 18th birthday, and then told them that he was incredibly disappointed in them both and gestured for the kid to come back with him towards his car. The parents were apologetic all of a sudden and immediately canceled the trip, but the damage and neglect was already done over many years and couldn't be undone in a moment. Polyamory is rooted in selfishness. Every polyamorous couple I see, I try to figure out whose idea it was and who cries themselves to sleep every night. Without fail, that's how it appears to work. Anyone who can flatter themselves as a good person after compelling the person they allegedly love the most in this world to accept being cheated on pain of loneliness is an absolute moral black hole that will be happy to wreck anything they touch for their own pleasure, and so it should come as no surprise that we don't want them anywhere near this organization. These things are never contained to the sexual sphere either. Clinton screwed an intern and then proceeded to screw the country, despite what the bumper stickers may have told you. The Epstein revelations, limited as they are, demonstrate that the imperial bourgeoisie were utterly sexually corrupted before they were utterly politically corrupted. You cannot politically trust a man who cheats on his wife or a woman who cheats on her husband. Furthermore, family is the stuff community is made of, and community is the stuff country is made of. Admitting this hyper-capitalist logic of eternal competition, even to the familiar sphere, has utterly ruined it. Families are more broken than they've ever been in this country, to the point that even conservatives are questioning the capitalism that wrought this devastation. Polyamory is not the only social concept undermining it, but it's the one most directly and openly undermining it, and it has no redeeming value to society otherwise. If you look at history, you'll see a correlation between the percentage of men in a society who cannot find partners and the amount of violence that society experiences in the aggregate. Societies that tolerate some form of polyamory either collapse in violent revolution in the long run, or heavily restrict it so that in practice only the bourgeoisie can afford it. This is why we specifically allowed a religious exemption. Those religions that tolerate some form of polyamory inevitably have evolved some restrictions on the practice that prevent it from destroying the rest of society in this manner. Monogamy is the form of family that predominates in a healthy society, not experiencing the constant threat of political violence. Also, if none of that persuaded you, dear viewer, anarchists think polyamory is a good idea. If these unwashed hippies swear by it, that alone should tell you it's a stupid idea too ultra-radical to ever work in the real world that will inevitably devolve towards fascism on a long enough time scale. I don't expect that the radical Republicans will weigh in on too many other cultural issues. Most of them either don't bleed over into directly harming the working class like polyamory does, and of those that do, they're either so universally despised like pedophiles that issuing a denunciation of the practice would be redundant, or they come with benefits to society as well as drawbacks, and workers of goodwill can come to different conclusions about them, and therefore the culture truce would be operative. Anyway, the second thing we voted through on Friday was approving an official text of an amicus curiae brief we intend to file in the case United States versus Ianov Popov et al., better known as the court case that the Uhurus and Black Hammer are facing. The text was approved and we'll be filing it as soon as possible, hopefully by this Wednesday. I'm going to read the text to you and then we'll talk about it. The Honorable Judge presiding over United States versus Ianov Popov et al. The radical Republicans file this amicus curiae brief to better inform Your Honor of the special circumstances of this case, so that justice may be done and our Constitution shine undimmed. The African People's Socialist Party, referred to after this simply as the Uhurus, are accused of running for office on an anti-imperialist platform that would benefit Russian foreign policy while being in contact with a Russian who is supposedly directing them to do these things. These charges are a clear and present danger to constitutional liberty. They effectively make criminals out of people for having the same foreign policy as our founding fathers while running for office and happening to know a Russian. My best friend had a Russian girlfriend in college, and I also agree with the foreign policy of the founding fathers. Does the prosecution intend to arrest me too for my political activities? The prosecution in this case is ridiculous on its face. The right to petition Congress for a redress of grievances is recognized by the very First Amendment to our Constitution. The right of communist and other extremist ideological groups to organize and carry on legal politics in this country was recognized in Yates versus United States and Brandenburg versus Ohio. There is no indication in the text of either the Bill of Rights or standing precedent that suggests that these rights are contingent on how well you know a Russian and agree with them. The prosecution's case is so preposterous that my organization suspects something besides justice is afoot. The tactics the FBI historically used to suppress various anti-imperialist movements in this country evolved over time. Originally, during the first Red Scare in 1919, it was straightforward repression. People were arrested, beaten, and deported for being in the wrong party or having the wrong associations. It created sympathy for those martyrs among the voting public and strengthened their movement enough to partially assume state power during the New Deal era. By the 1960s, therefore, the FBI changed its tactics. They sent infiltrators into various socialist, communist, and anti-imperialist groups who would try to disrupt organizing efforts by causing disputes within the groups. They also sponsored organizations like the Congress of Cultural Freedom, which were intended to move the focus of the left towards anything but class and empire, and counted various well-known public intellectuals among their members. My organization believes that the play now for the FBI to suppress anti-imperialists is to combine the two previous tactics in the most nefarious way, and straightforwardly repress those anti-imperialist organizations with the ideology most hostile and alien to average Americans. This creates a double bind for all other anti-imperialists. Either other anti-imperialist groups ignore the repression and allow a legal precedent to be set against anti-imperialist speech and organizing, or they defend the repressed organization with its repellent ideology, and that repellent ideology spreads amongst other anti-imperialists, and anti-imperialism becomes associated with abominable things in the minds of the voting public. Either way, the FBI prevents anti-imperialists from winning an election. The reason we have concluded this is because the raid on the Uhurus happened concurrently with a raid on another black nationalist organization, Black Hammer, which was ostentatiously and obnoxiously even more unsympathetic to the average American voter. Black Hammer was led by a self-obsessed cynic formerly employed by Madonna named Augustus C. Romaine Jr., also known as Ghazi Kodzo, and fleeced liberals full of white guilt for reparations. They were renowned for denouncing Holocaust victim Anne Frank, demanding money from Antifa, and doing rallies eerily similar to the Nazis but with chants of "Land back" instead of "Heil Hitler." The main thing these two organizations have in common is that they are the most unsympathetic domestic organizations going that support Russia in its current war. That is why the raids targeted them specifically. While the radical Republicans are well known in anti-imperialist circles for our numerous and vehement criticisms of the Uhuru's race nationalist, segregationist, secessionist, and anti-American ideology, even we must admit that they have zero dead bodies in their basement, literally and metaphorically. What is repellent about them to the American people is that race nationalist, segregationist, secessionist, and anti-American ideology, not their deeds. To our knowledge, they have committed no crime. We hate what they have to say, but we will defend to the death the Constitution they despise that guarantees their right to peacefully say it. The purpose of this prosecution is not the punishment of any supposed crime, but the attempted social engineering of an entire milieu of American political sentiment by a deeply politicized deep state gone rogue and hijacking the justice system to its own nefarious ends. Agreeing with George Washington about non-intervention abroad is not a crime. Organizing to run candidates who agree with him is not a crime. Happening to advocate things that might also occasionally benefit foreign countries is not a crime. Depriving American citizens of their constitutional liberties over politics and not justice is a crime, though one given no functional legal redress by statute, which is why the deep state commits it so brazenly in these proceedings. For all of these reasons, we request Your Honor find the defendants not guilty of all charges. Thank you in advance for your consideration of our analysis, and may liberty and justice prevail in this and every American courtroom. This organization has withheld its support for the hands-off Uhuru thing for a good while because of the analysis mentioned in the brief, namely that this court case is being used to make wildly unpopular ideological stances like land back common amongst anti-imperialists. I even mentioned that it put us in a double bind because supporting them lets that self-defeating ultra-radicalism spread, while not supporting them lets the deep state criminalize anti-imperialism. So why did we eventually file this brief in support of their case? I thought about this issue a good while, and I figured out the only way to Houdini anti-imperialists out of this double bind and pursued it. The Uhurus wanted and expected radical Republican support for their case. We withheld it for about a year and ruthlessly criticized every single position they held that alienated them from the conservative American workers instead. It blew up our cooperation with the CPI, it cost us friends and influence in the short term, but it worked. The Uhurus now sound like this.
Because what Trump did, as we know, is that he ran for office in a fashion that criticized the entire system. Trump ran for office declaring opposition not just to the Democratic Party, but opposition to the wars that the United States government was engaged in various places around the world, calling out this whole issue of nation building or something to that effect, that this government has historically been involved in overthrowing government, overturning governments that it doesn't like, and then characterizing what it's doing as some kind of nation building process in other countries. And Trump came out opposed to that. Trump came out opposed to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That's the entity that is being utilized in a poorly concealed, to provide a poorly concealed war that's been made, even as we have this discussion right now, by the United States against Russia, using Ukraine also as a part of the vehicle to do that. Trump had initially come out being opposed to NATO, saying that the Europeans should be able to pay for their own defense, as they characterized it. Trump was somebody who opposed the status quo and the Atlanticist project that had been the governing body internationally, more or less, although loosely designed, but under the leadership of the United States, that was responsible for establishing the basic policies and directions for the colonizers throughout the world. And he came out against that. So he was treated initially by the bourgeoisie, by the colonizers, as a joke. And in fact, they gave him all kinds of free publicity because they didn't take him seriously. But what he had done was tap into deep sentiments of people in this country who are disgusted by the way things are going, and especially white people, 57% of whom would vote for Trump. In 2016, and the following election. He did what most of the white leftists, so-called communists, and others didn't dare to do. He criticized the entire setup, and the people wanted somebody who would expose the system, who would call it out, etc. And even though Trump did it in a fashion that was to satisfy the white nationalist sentiments of the white population in this country, it was something that definitely and without question called out the legitimacy of the system. He even criticized Hillary Clinton.
And for good measure, Caleb now sounds like this again sometimes.
Alrighty, unfortunately StreamYard is doing that thing where I have to scroll up, which is obnoxious, but that's okay. And so I'm going to start answering people's questions. The first is a Rumble rant. First one is a Rumble rant. And it is the dissolution of Yugoslavia an example of degrowth? Yes, it is. And I would add that part of the degrowth of Yugoslavia was breaking it apart, playing the different nationalities against each other, because it's way easier to implement austerity on a local level than it is on a national level. This is something that the degrowth wing of the ultra-rich have tried in the United States. Local control is something that the ultra-rich often use when demanding austerity. Local control, decentralization, is often a mechanism for implementing degrowth and austerity. And the Ford Foundation and others have gone on record saying that yes, they want to decentralize government and break apart a central authority in order to more effectively carry out degrowth. And that's why, that is why we are very much trying to oppose that. And I'm not in favor of any separatist movement in the United States. I don't want California to secede. Right? I would support the right of a colonized people to break away if they wanted that, but we're not trying to balkanize or break apart the United States because that's what the ultra-rich want, right? It's way easier to implement austerity when you break a country up into little pieces. And we see that with Yugoslavia. Michael Parenti, in his book To Kill a Nation, gives a great example of that. And yes, they broke apart Yugoslavia piece by piece, and in all the places they broke it apart, they implemented neoliberal economic reforms that smashed apart the economy. So I would say, yes, the destruction of Yugoslavia is a great example of degrowth.
If they have to be land back crews, they should be the kind of land back crew that holds it to be the secret shame that it ought to be. They should mention their positions sparingly and be embarrassed about it while still being honest, if they have to be land back crews at all. Despite that last clip, Caleb hasn't quite learned this lesson yet. Here he is reminding the world of this terrible praxis of his. I'm not talking about defending the Yahoos, I'm talking about this stupid chant right here. As we just saw, O'Malley's changed the way he talks to the American workers to attempt to avoid unnecessary antagonism because he realizes that American imperialism won't fall without them on his side. Caleb, on the other hand, doesn't appear bothered in the least if American imperialism strangles the world forever, just so long as he can have his stupid little land back treason chance. He doesn't care about the workers that are alienated by land back. He doesn't really care about that anti-monopoly coalition he waxes poetic about. If he did, he would find some other way to show solidarity with the Uhurus than repeating this imperialist pig dog mistake over and over. As far as Caleb and the CPI go, I guess it's still, kid gloves off, because they haven't learned their lesson yet. Land backaroos that really want to help should frame their anti-American theory by saying things along the lines of what Caleb said in that first clip about believing in the theoretical right of colonized people to secede even though he doesn't want them to, and not by glorifying extremely divisive calls for the destruction of America like land back chants. But let's put a pin in that for the moment. We'll come right back after I finish explaining how we praxised ourselves out of this double bind. Now, Caleb's not as important because the CPI isn't the organization facing prison time. So if he persists in being a land backaroo and therefore functionally an imperialist, it's not as important. What matters is how our praxis changed how Uhurus talk about these things, because they're the ones being given a microphone on purpose by the deep state via this prosecution. And they have clearly changed their praxis in a way that Caleb's still too arrogant to fully commit to. O'Malley front-loaded his video mostly trying to make nice to Trump voters. He couldn't help himself from being a segregationist, so he still slandered us as white nationalists and asserted that black people can't be Americans, but compared to the reception we used to get from the Uhurus, it's surprisingly mild. The second half of the video is where he reasserted that Uhuru theory hadn't fundamentally changed by trying to explain it to Trump voters, and also was performatively curmudgeonly about Abraham Lincoln in what I'm pretty sure was a personal shout-out, but he did say, "Send your money," instead of "give us reparations." They can drop all the passive-aggressive diss tracks on me that they like, so long as they don't alienate the workers. Alienating the workers with anti-American land-back lines is delaying and obstructing the revolution. Lenin, as played by Jean-Luc Picard in this next clip, told us that delaying and obstructing the revolution made one an enemy of the revolution, even if one was your friend, your lover, or your party colleague. So my insistent goading of them into not being enemies of the revolution ended up being an incredibly goaded praxis.
Have you shown it to Plekhanov?
No. He's seen other things of mine.
And?
He thinks my style is florid and rhetorical. What do you think?
He's right. But Georges always puts style first. He's a great European. He once said, not long ago, that I had no style at all. In the French sense, of course. No, it's not the style which bothers me. I think it's too soft.
I don't understand.
All right. How do we achieve this future that you talk of?
By struggle. How else?
But against whom?
The state and the classes whose interests it protects.
The duty of the revolutionary is to fight those forces and personalities which impede or obstruct the socialist revolution.
That's what I said.
No, it isn't what you said, and you must see the difference. The future is less than 6 months away. We make the future with every new theory we evolve, every organizational change we set in progress. There will be no revolution. Millions will not be mobilized against the Tsarist state unless we make it possible. We are Marxists. We understand, as the anarchists and liberals cannot, the nature of power of the state and so on, but it is not enough to know the world. We must learn how to change it. And in order to do that, we must first and foremost build an organization, a party, to develop the theory and lead the revolutionary struggle. You see what I mean? Objectively, the enemy can be your best friend, your lover, your party colleague, the chairman of your local branch, the editor of your party journal. The enemy is he who impedes the course of the revolution. Ah, the battle for now, Comrade Trotsky, is not with the Tsar. It's with ourselves.
Anyway, I never expected that I would be able to change the fundamental lines of other people's orgs, but I knew that anti-imperialist victory was far more important than gooning off to the black belt in public, and that anti-imperialists couldn't do both. So the radical Republicans' way out of the double bind was to compel as much change in Uhuru theory and praxis as possible through direct confrontation, so that the deep state's purposes of spreading terrible theory and praxis among anti-imperialists would be defeated. Now that that has been accomplished, the court case won't be heard until sometime in the fall, so we still have enough time to file this amicus curiae brief and protect our constitutional right to agree with George Washington about imperialism, too. We're perfectly happy to explain to the judge in all of America what the deep state attempted to do, and urge dismissal of all charges on the basis that the justice system shouldn't be used as a backdoor tool of social engineering by the deep state. We don't have to accept terrible land backroom theory or the dimming of our constitutional rights. We tackled them both, and having fought Uhuru theory head-on gives us more authority, not less, to urge the dismissal of these charges against them. If we had meekly agreed with them the whole time for fear of rocking the boat, nobody would care what we have to say now. But established and principled political opponents of the Uhurus speaking up in their defense, that inherently matters more. Now, back to that pin. For the record, anyone can call themselves a victim, or, in this rubric, colonized. The silly idea of Appalachia being a nation that Caleb's appeared to jettison since my video calling him out on it was based on the idea of colonized Irish slaves fleeing into the Appalachian backwoods. To refer back to becoming evil yet again, another precondition of genocide is a national victimhood narrative. A colonized nation is just one that sees itself as a victim, either rightly as in the case of, say, Vietnam, or wrongly as in the case of Appalachia and whatever woke land backaroo goofery is being cooked up in South Dakota by the Bush Foundation. The very concept, when applied outside of the milieu of formal European colonial empires, is spurious and easily hijacked by fascists. This is why Marxist-Leninists talk about our opposition to imperialism, which is objective and nobody can deny exists, instead of colonialism, which is subjective and easily bent according to different people's vibes and feels. This video isn't really about the Yahoos, though, so I don't want to dwell on them too much. So long as they finally understand that their opinions on the national question are deeply offensive to the workers of this great country, and they change their praxis in light of that significant fact, so as not to sabotage anti-imperialism's real chance of victory in our lifetimes, I'm content to ignore them and even wish them well on those occasions where their theory and praxis is sound. So let's move on to the real news, the biggest news. Tobar isn't the only locus of real-world radical Republican organizing. We have an organization on the ground in Lawrence City, South Carolina, where we have real candidates doing real politics in their community. We made 2 endorsements in Lawrence City this cycle, one for the re-election of the mayor, Nathan Senn, and one for the election of a new sheriff, Chris Wilkes. Working with them both on a regular basis is Radical Republicans Vice Secretary Robert Lamb, man of God, lion of the working class, and our man in South Carolina. Radical Republican organizing in Lawrence City really got its start with Senn's first administration as mayor. We weren't even refounded yet when he was first elected, but he was already putting our ideas into practice. The city government slashed red tape, allowing the rapid creation of many new small businesses. The extra taxes that brought into the city was carefully invested in infrastructure and services that would support more business growth, and the job market has surged along with the local population as people started moving in. Nathan Senn didn't govern like a zombie Reaganite either. The economic growth was shared widely, and unionization efforts have been supported by the city's administration. Local 419 Pipe Fitters Union went from a mostly defunct set of graybeards collecting pensions from otherwise departed employers to a growing and active local with new workers and new businesses. He put in community gardens, which is like a homestead act writ small that lets anyone without a job support themselves if they were willing to work hard. He gave power back to the people by creating volunteer panels that tackled blight and slumlordism. Before he was even elected, he was donating much of his pay as a family lawyer to faith-based detox and rehab services out of First Baptist Church, so his community would have access to those things. Another thing Senn did was reform and expand the Lawrence City Police Department. Working with a like-minded policeman named Chris Wilkes, a lot of corruption was brought to heel, and the police were brought together with a civilian population that hadn't always trusted them. And before any Antifers get all huffy in the comments, this is precisely as it should be. All cops are bastards implies that there's no point working with cops to make policing any better for the working class. But the workers themselves recognize the value of the police in keeping their communities free of crime. If cops are bastards, how much worse are criminals? Eric Adams rode this very sentiment, prevalent amongst working class blacks and Hispanics no less, to the mayoralty of New York City. But reforming the police means embracing the reformers among the police. No anarchy, and most commies would be unwilling to do that. Radical Republicans, on the other hand, proudly endorsed Chris Wilkes for sheriff of Lawrence City this cycle. He was up against Dirty Don Reynolds, a sign of the dying good old boy establishment that used to have his clutches on the whole of Lawrence City before Nate Senn showed up. Well, Dirty Don Reynolds won the Republican primary, but so did Nathan Senn. So we're batting 500% in our endorsement so far this year because the Republicans pretty much guaranteed to win the general in Lawrence City. So Senn will get another term as mayor, but Dirty Don will get to be sheriff. But Chris Wilkes is still there, still policing, and the Radical Republicans aren't going anywhere either. Wilkes or someone like him will yet be sheriff one day. There is a real movement growing in strength in South Carolina. That state, which has been the beginning of so much American history, is dialectically also the new beginning of radical republicanism in our era. I dare any currently existing communist organization in America to produce a record of real-world accomplishment for any of its elected politicians half as cool as that. The phrase elected politicians would be the hurdle most of them couldn't jump. Accomplishing anything of note would be the hurdle that would catch the rest. They're all very loud on the internet, but they do nothing. We radical Republicans put our noses to the grindstone, greet the American workers as equals, and deliver results. A movement with good theory and praxis doesn't just stay still, though. It grows. What's happening in Lawrence City can't be the only instance in this gigantic country of already existing Republican politicians spontaneously doing praxis. There have to be others, and I want to learn about them. If you have such a politician in your neck of the woods, I want to know about them, endorse them, and maybe even interview them, and hopefully eventually organize them, so mention them in the comments below. If you would like to become such a Republican politician and you are not currently, get in touch with me in those comments because we want to help you save your community. But wait, there's more. As Honest Abe taught us, labor is prior to and independent of capital. Labor has to be a core part of any coalition we radical Republicans weld together, or we radical Republicans will fail. That sounds like a really tall order, though, because zombie Reaganism's message to labor was, slap some personal responsibility on that bad boy and walk it off. But I already know that this realignment is going to happen, and how. So the personal responsibility line can be flipped on its head. What will the GOP replace zombie Reaganism's labor plank with? It can and should be labor's personal responsibility to figure that out. Our demands ought to be whatever organized labor's demands are. Organized labor, after all, is not a government bureaucracy. It requires zero tax dollars or extra regulations to secure the worker better pay and working conditions. And, unlike New Deal government bureaucracies, organized labor has a long and storied history of delivering concrete gains to the working class. Our entire labor plank should just be demanding that the labor unions assume total ownership of the companies they organize, endorsing whatever gains short of that they can secure in the meanwhile, and providing the political assistance necessary to help them prevail against the bosses. But there is also the matter of the political control of the unions themselves. Class collaborationist Democrat bosses maintain a stranglehold on most unions for most of our lives, and their like would never work with Republicans, especially not to achieve final victory over the bosses they get rich collaborating with. Even for the Teamsters, this is the era in which Jimmy Hoffa ruled. But the Teamsters changed. A reform slate led by Sean O'Brien swept internal Teamsters elections. Soon afterwards, the new team at the Teamsters had an opportunity to demonstrate their newfound militancy as the UPS contract came up for renewal. Sean O'Brien seized that opportunity like an opportunity-seizing machine, delivering a historic UPS contract that marked a new era for union organizing in this country. And the United Auto Workers, in those days of yore, the UAW was so corrupt that it caught the sort of federal consent decree usually reserved for police departments doing hate crimes. One of the terms of their consent decree was clean union elections, which seemingly drove the class collaborationists out of power. The leader of this reform UAW ticket was a guy named Shawn Fain, and on the surface, his ascent did appear to be a genuine reform. He introduced a new strategy, the stand-up strike, to the realm of industrial bargaining, and it caused outsized chaos at the big three automakers compared to the amount of strike funds it drew down. By the end of the strike, they had secured gains nobody had expected, and even corporate media was praising Shawn Fain. But hold on. Because the UAW would then go on to endorse Genocide Joe, even though they issued a separate statement endorsing a ceasefire in Gaza. We radical Republicans even denounced them for it at the time. It appears to me that class collaboration in this era of labor militancy has taken on a different character than the Hoffas of yore. After the Teamsters started winning big contracts again, union leaders that didn't deliver big contracts were obviously going to lose favor with the working class. So the class collaborationists were going to have to pose as reformers, and were going to have to win big contracts like the reformers did in order to burnish their credentials. Fortunately, Detroit has been recently bailed out and could afford to bankroll these victories. And the feds had a consent decree in place that gave them an unusual ability to affect internal UAW politics, never mind a history of collaboration between the UAW and CIA-led New Left groups since the 60s. The UAW and Shawn Fain represent a newer, updated labor aristocracy. They will ultimately get the money for their outsized wage gains from bombing and exploiting the third world, which is why the UAW is riding with Biden despite their crocodile tears about Gaza. The imperial bourgeoisie have finally woken up to the need to pay the guillotine insurance, and Shawn Fain is their insurance salesman. But this setup is premised on the continued existence of bosses and empire. It moves the exploitation abroad to fund a puppet show of pretend socialism here at home. They're probably the biggest, clearest danger to radical republicanism since the land back psyop. They will delay and obstruct the revolution. They must be opposed. Their natural opposition is the real reformers, people like Sean O'Brien and the Teamsters leadership, but it's also in people like Chris Smalls, leader of the Amazon Labor Union, which recently won a union recognition election in an Amazon warehouse in New York City. They started out unaffiliated to any other union because of organic distrust of the Democrat class collaborationists among the working class. So they took on one of the world's biggest companies by themselves and began winning. Despite craven shitlibs like former Obama administration ghoul Jay Carney making essentially racist statements about Chris Smalls, they have only been growing in power and organizing capacity. Well, the battle lines are being drawn in precisely the manner they expected they would. The reform unions are on one side led by the Teamsters and ALU, and the class collaborationists are on the other led by the UAW. The Democrats are already in bed with the UAW, so eventually the Teamsters and ALU were bound to realize that their fortunes lie with each other as well as the Republican Party. While they haven't joined the GOP yet, The Teamsters have explicitly rejected breaking with us and our voters or endorsing Democrats. And just as importantly in the long term, the Teamsters and ALU have voted to affiliate. Now that the Amazon Labor Union can see the new terrain of the labor struggle, they've realized that their future is with fellow reformers like Sean O'Brien and not with imperial sellouts like Sean Fain. I was expecting the Teamsters and ALU to be working together long before either worked with the GOP, but I wasn't expecting them to formally join forces, and I wasn't expecting it to happen so fast. The next step in this evolving realignment is for them to realize that their enemy is tied up with the Democrats, and that the enemy of their enemy, the Republicans, must be their friend. We Republicans will have to move towards them more to cement this, but it's already begun to happen. It was mostly Republicans voting not to break the rail strike, while the squad scabbed. Everything is still in flux at the moment, so it's not obvious to anyone who isn't looking, but expect to see more Marco Rubios voting for labor in future. Also, Trump's personal history involving stiffing unionized contractors had a big role to play in delaying this realignment, but the trend is still advancing nonetheless. I have no idea how long this video is going to end up being, but the script is enormous. It's nice to have this much progress to report. I hope hearing about it motivates you to organize with us. The link is at the end of every long-form video I put out now, radicalgop.net. Check out our theory and get involved. And now you know, and knowing is half the battle.
Hot Take Express.